People always ask when we became a family, but they never believe me when I tell them it all started with a lie that was only supposed to last one weekend. The little boy standing beside the oversized painting smiled at the reporter as cameras flashed around him inside the bright community art gallery. The painting showed three men beneath a maple tree glowing with the colors of early fall. One was clearly his father. The second stood slightly behind them, smiling with the quiet warmth of someone who had finally found home. The boy pointed at the second man. "He wasn't my dad yet," he said. "He was just pretending." Everyone laughed softly, assuming it was a child's imagination, but I felt my chest tighten because every word was true. 6 years earlier, I was surrounded by half-packed moving boxes inside my small apartment in Cedar Ridge. My lease ended in 4 days, and on Monday morning I was supposed to drive nearly 1,200 miles to Seattle for the illustration job I had dreamed about since college. My sketchbooks were stacked beside the front door, my coffee mugs were wrapped in newspaper, and every empty shelf echoed with the strange silence that comes before a goodbye. I kept telling myself that leaving would be easy because there was nothing tying me to this town anymore. At least that was the lie I repeated every morning. Then someone knocked on my door. I opened it expecting a delivery driver, but instead I found Ethan Walker standing on my porch with his hands buried deep inside the pockets of his navy jacket. He looked as calm as always, yet something restless hid behind his gray eyes. Ethan wasn't the kind of man who showed up unexpectedly. He measured every word, every step, every decision. That's probably why seeing him there immediately made me nervous. Before I could ask why he had come over, a familiar voice shouted from the driveway. "Noah." 8-year-old Liam climbed out of the passenger seat of Ethan's pickup truck and ran toward me holding a folded piece of construction paper decorated with colorful stars. "I finished the drawing you helped me with," he announced proudly. I knelt beside him and unfolded the paper. 3 stick figures stood in front of a little white house. One was labeled Dad. Another was labeled me. The third simply said Noah. My smile came naturally, but I noticed Ethan looking away before our eyes met. Liam hugged me without hesitation. He always had. Ever since Ethan and his son had moved next door almost 2 years earlier, Liam had wandered into my life one drawing, one board game, and one Saturday pancake breakfast at a time. Somewhere along the way, spending time together had become routine. Helping Liam with homework felt normal. Fixing Ethan's fence together felt normal. Watching old movies on rainy evenings while Liam fell asleep halfway through them somehow felt normal too. Maybe that was exactly why I had accepted the job in Seattle. Staying had started to feel dangerous. Ethan cleared his throat. "Can we talk for a minute?" Liam skipped back toward the truck, humming to himself as if he already knew this conversation wasn't meant for him. Ethan waited until his son was out of earshot before finally speaking. "I need a favor." I leaned against the doorframe, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my stomach. "What kind of favor?" He hesitated longer than I expected. "This weekend my parents are celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary at the family lake house. My entire family will be there." I nodded slowly. "Sounds nice." Liam told everyone at school he has 2 dads. I blinked. Ethan gave a tired smile that lasted barely a second. "The teacher mentioned it to my mother during a school fundraiser. Now everyone thinks." He stopped, rubbing the back of his neck. "They think you and I are together." Silence settled between us. Somewhere across the street a lawnmower started, and a dog barked twice before everything became quiet again. Ethan finally looked directly at me. "Noah." His voice was steady, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath it. "Would you pretend we're a family for one weekend?" I should have said no. Every practical reason told me to close the door, wish Ethan luck, and go back to packing the life I had already decided to leave behind. Instead, I heard myself asking the one question that changed everything. What exactly would I have to do? Ethan let out a slow breath, almost as if he had been expecting me to refuse until that moment. "Just come with us from Friday evening until Sunday afternoon. Smile. Eat dinner with my family. Let Liam believe nothing is different. Then we come home, and everything goes back to normal." He said the last sentence too quickly, as though repeating it would make it true. I glanced toward the pickup truck where Liam was drawing invisible shapes across the fogged passenger window with his finger. "Does Liam know this is pretend?" Ethan followed my eyes. "No, and I want to keep it that way for the weekend. He has been excited ever since my mother invited us." Something about that answer settled heavily inside me. Liam had always been honest, almost painfully honest. If he believed we were already a family, it was because no one had ever told him otherwise. I looked back at Ethan. You know I leave on Monday. His expression barely changed, but I caught the faint tightening around his jaw. I know. 2 simple words. No questions. No attempt to change my mind. Somehow that hurt more than I expected. All right, I finally said. 1 weekend. Relief crossed his face so quickly that it disappeared before I could be certain I had seen it. Thank you. Friday arrived faster than I wanted. By late afternoon, my apartment looked even emptier than before. Every packed box reminded me that this town was already becoming part of my past. I locked the front door, carried a single overnight bag outside, and found Ethan loading suitcases into the back of his truck. Liam waved so enthusiastically that he nearly dropped the stuffed fox tucked beneath one arm. You are coming, he shouted before I had even reached the driveway. I told Grandpa you would. Ethan opened the passenger door for me. Ready? I nodded even though I was not. The drive to the lake house would take a little over 3 hours, following quiet state highways lined with cornfields, small diners, and weathered red barns that seemed untouched by time. Liam spent the first hour talking nonstop about fishing, board games, and the giant maple tree behind his grandparents' house. Eventually, he drifted to sleep with his forehead resting against the window, still clutching the stuffed fox. The peaceful silence that followed felt strangely intimate. Ethan kept both hands on the steering wheel before speaking without taking his eyes off the road. There are 3 rules. I smiled faintly. I figured there would be. First, we only act like a couple when my family is around. Second, we do not encourage Liam to think anything is changing permanently. Third, when we leave Sunday afternoon, everything returns to the way it was before. I watched the passing landscape blur beyond the glass. Simple enough. I almost told him about Seattle again. I almost admitted that after Sunday there would not be a familiar routine waiting for either of us. Instead, I swallowed the truth and looked out the window. We stopped at a roadside gas station just before sunset. Liam insisted on choosing snacks for everyone. He returned carrying pretzels for himself, chocolate-covered almonds for Ethan, and a cinnamon roll for me without asking what I wanted. Ethan noticed my surprise. He remembers your favorite bakery order. Liam shrugged as if it were obvious. Families remember stuff. Neither Ethan nor I answered. Darkness settled across the highway by the time we reached the lake. Warm lights glowed from the large cedar house overlooking the water, and laughter floated through the open windows before the truck had even stopped. My heartbeat quickened. Ethan turned off the engine, but did not move. One last thing, he said quietly. If this gets uncomfortable, tell me. We leave immediately. Before I could respond, the front door burst open. An older woman hurried down the porch steps with tears already shining in her eyes. She wrapped me in a warm embrace before I even had the chance to introduce myself. You must be Noah, she said with a smile that felt completely genuine. We have been waiting a very long time to meet the man who finally brought my son back to life. For the next few minutes, I barely had time to think. Ethan's mother guided me through the front door with one hand on my shoulder while introducing me to grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles, and neighbors who had gathered for the anniversary weekend. Every smiling face seemed convinced that I had been part of Ethan's life for much longer than I actually had. I kept waiting for someone to notice the hesitation in my voice or the uncertainty behind my smile, but instead they welcomed me with effortless kindness. Liam slipped his small hand into mine as naturally as if he had done it every day of his life. Come on, he whispered. I want to show you my favorite place. Before I could answer, Ethan gently rested his hand against the middle of my back, guiding us toward the backyard. The gesture lasted only a second, but it felt surprisingly real. The lake shimmered beneath the fading orange sky, and dozens of string lights stretched between towering maple trees. Long wooden tables overflowed with homemade casseroles, grilled vegetables, fresh rolls, and pies cooling on wire racks. Children chased one another across the grass while older relatives laughed over stories they had probably told for years. I suddenly understood why Ethan had wanted Liam to experience this weekend without awkward questions or sympathetic looks. It was not about pretending for the adults. It was about protecting the little boy who already believed he belonged here with 2 people he loved. Dinner began just as the sun disappeared behind the trees. I found myself seated beside Ethan while Liam sat proudly between us until his grandmother laughed and told him that couples usually sat together. Liam happily switched seats without realizing how flustered the change made both of us. Throughout dinner, relatives asked ordinary questions about my work, my apartment, and how Ethan and I had met. We answered carefully, finishing each other's sentences whenever the conversation drifted too close to the truth. It became easier than I expected. Ethan remembered that I preferred tea over coffee after dinner. I remembered that he always removed the pickles from his sandwiches before taking the first bite. His sister smiled knowingly. You two have definitely been together long enough to notice the little things. Ethan glanced toward me with an embarrassed smile, but said nothing. Later that evening, someone suggested playing a family game that had apparently become a tradition during every reunion. Each couple would answer simple questions to see how well they knew each other. I quietly hoped Ethan would find an excuse to skip it, but Liam was already cheering before either of us could object. The first few questions were harmless. What was your partner's favorite season? Ethan answered autumn before I could speak. He was right. What was your partner's favorite comfort food? I answered tomato soup with grilled cheese, earning another correct answer. The room filled with laughter every time someone guessed wrong, but Ethan and I somehow continued matching each response. My surprise grew with every round. He knew I always sketched with mechanical pencils instead of wooden ones. He knew I hated alarm clocks with loud buzzing sounds. He even remembered that I never finished the crust on blueberry pie. All right, Ethan's cousin announced with a grin. Last question. What is the one thing your partner fears more than anything else? The room grew unexpectedly quiet. I lowered my eyes, assuming Ethan would simply guess. Instead, he answered almost immediately, being asked to stay somewhere only to discover later that he was never truly wanted there. Every sound around the table seemed to disappear. I slowly turned toward him. I had never said those exact words out loud. Not once. Yet somehow he had seen through years of carefully built walls with nothing more than quiet observation. His expression changed the moment our eyes met, as if he realized he had revealed far more than he intended. Before either of us could say anything, Liam wrapped both of his arms around our shoulders and laughed. See? I told everyone you already act like a family. Warm laughter returned around the table, breaking the heavy silence, but my heart refused to settle. Much later, after the dishes had been cleared away and everyone drifted toward the lakeside bonfire, my phone vibrated inside my jacket pocket. I stepped onto the quiet front porch and glanced at the screen. The message confirmed that my relocation paperwork had been finalized. My moving company would arrive at 8 o'clock Monday morning exactly as scheduled. I quickly locked the screen before anyone could see it, but I was too late. Standing just inside the open front door, unnoticed until that moment, Liam had read the single word glowing across the display before it disappeared. Seattle. The single word stayed in Liam's eyes long after the screen had gone dark. He did not ask me about it. He simply looked at me with a quiet expression that no 8-year-old should have known how to wear, then forced a small smile before running back toward the bonfire where the rest of the family was roasting marshmallows. I slipped my phone into my pocket, suddenly wishing I had never accepted the offer to come here. It had only been one evening, yet leaving already felt more complicated than packing boxes and driving west. I joined everyone beside the fire, trying to pretend nothing had happened. Ethan's father was telling an old story about teaching Ethan how to build a wooden canoe when he was 12. Every few minutes someone laughed, and Liam usually laughed the loudest. Tonight he barely spoke. He stayed close beside me, quietly leaning against my arm while staring into the glowing fire. Ethan noticed immediately. Everything all right, buddy? Liam nodded too quickly. I am just tired. His answer sounded convincing enough to everyone else, but Ethan kept watching him with the careful attention only a parent could have. Eventually the evening ended, and everyone drifted back inside the lake house. Ethan's mother showed us to the upstairs hallway with an apologetic smile. We thought we had enough bedrooms, but your cousins arrived earlier than expected. I hope you do not mind sharing the guest room. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before thanking her. Once the bedroom door closed behind us, neither of us spoke. The room was simple and comfortable, with warm quilts, a wooden dresser, and exactly one queen-size bed beneath a window overlooking the lake. Ethan let out a quiet sigh. I can sleep on the floor. Absolutely not, I answered. You invited me here. We can survive sharing one bed for 2 nights. He smiled for the first time since dinner. You always make difficult things sound reasonable. We unpacked in comfortable silence until the lights flickered once, then twice. A second later, the entire house went dark. Someone downstairs laughed and announced that another summer storm had knocked out the electricity. Rain began tapping softly against the roof. Ethan found a flashlight inside the dresser while I opened the curtains. Lightning flashed across the lake, briefly turning the water silver before darkness returned. The power usually comes back quickly, Ethan said, unless the old transformer decides otherwise. We sat on opposite sides of the bed listening to the steady rhythm of rain. Without the lights, the house felt strangely peaceful. There was nothing to distract us except the conversation both of us had been avoiding. Your family is wonderful, I said quietly. Ethan nodded. They have been trying very hard to make sure Liam never feels like he lost too much. His voice softened. Sometimes I think they worry about me even more than they worry about him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke again. Finally, Ethan looked toward the rain-covered window instead of at me. Daniel loved storms. It was the first time he had ever spoken his late husband's name in front of me. He used to make hot chocolate whenever the power went out. Liam was too young to remember much of it, but every time it rains he still asks if we have marshmallows. I listened without interrupting. Ethan rested his hands together as though carefully choosing every word. People keep telling me that moving forward does not mean leaving the past behind. I understand what they mean. I just do not always know how to believe it. I answered honestly. Maybe love is not something that gets replaced. Maybe it just makes room for more people than we ever expected. Ethan turned toward me. The flashlight resting on the nightstand cast a soft circle of light across his face. There was gratitude in his eyes, but there was something else too, something quieter and harder to hide. Before either of us could say another word, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. A gentle knock sounded on the bedroom door. Ethan opened it to find Liam, clutching his stuffed fox with both hands. I had a bad dream, he admitted in a tiny voice. Can I stay in here for a little while? Ethan smiled immediately. Of course. Liam climbed onto the bed between us, wrapping the blanket around himself before letting out a relieved sigh. Within minutes his breathing became slow, and even as he drifted back to sleep, his small hand reached instinctively toward mine beneath the blanket, while his other hand rested against Ethan's arm. Neither of us moved. We simply looked at the sleeping little boy lying peacefully between us, and for the first time that weekend, pretending felt less like acting and more like remembering a life that somehow already knew exactly where each of us belonged. Morning arrived with sunlight spilling across the lake and the faint scent of fresh coffee drifting through the open window. I woke before anyone else, careful not to disturb Liam, who had somehow managed to stretch across nearly the entire bed during the night. Ethan was already awake, sitting quietly in the wooden chair near the window with a mug warming his hands. He looked peaceful for the first time since we had arrived. When he noticed me opening my eyes, he smiled softly. Good morning. I smiled back. Did you sleep at all? Enough. Before either of us could continue, Liam stirred beneath the blankets, rubbed his eyes, and looked from Ethan to me with sleepy satisfaction. See, he mumbled. Families sleep better together. Ethan and I exchanged an awkward glance, but neither of us corrected him. Downstairs, the entire house buzzed with activity as relatives prepared breakfast. Pancakes sizzled on the griddle, bacon filled the kitchen with its familiar aroma, and someone was already arranging fresh flowers across the dining table. Ethan's mother greeted us with another warm hug before insisting that Noah and Ethan help carry picnic supplies down to the lakeside pavilion where the anniversary celebration would continue all afternoon. It felt strangely natural working beside Ethan. We loaded coolers, folded chairs, blankets, and baskets into an old utility cart while Liam raced ahead with his cousins. Every so often Ethan reached for the same box I was carrying, and we laughed at the small collisions without thinking about whether anyone was watching. At the pavilion, a local photographer had been hired to capture family memories throughout the weekend. One by one, every household gathered beneath an enormous maple tree overlooking the water. When it was finally our turn, I instinctively stepped aside. You two should take one with Liam, I said. This is your family. Before I could move farther away, Liam grabbed my wrist with surprising determination. No, he said. Families do not leave people out of the picture. The photographer smiled patiently while Ethan looked at me, silently waiting for my decision. I finally stepped back beside them. Liam stood proudly between us and reached for both of our hands. Without hesitation, Ethan gently intertwined his fingers with mine. The touch was light, respectful, and completely unexpected. There was no performance in it anymore. For one quiet moment, the camera disappeared, the relatives disappeared, and even the weekend itself seemed to disappear. Perfect, the photographer called as the shutter clicked several times. That looks like a family that has known each other forever. My heart tightened in a way I could not explain. Later that afternoon, while everyone else prepared for a friendly fishing competition, Ethan suggested we walk along the shoreline to gather kindling for the evening fire. The path curved through tall pine trees until it reached an old wooden dock extending into the calm lake. Ethan rested both hands against the weathered railing and stared across the water for several long seconds before speaking. "This is where I proposed to Daniel." His voice carried no bitterness, only quiet remembrance. I have not brought anyone back here since that day. I remained beside him without interrupting. After another moment, he continued, "I almost did not invite you this weekend." "Why?" He let out a slow breath. "Because I knew it would stop feeling like pretending." The honesty in his words settled gently between us. I searched for the right response, but found none. Instead, we watched a family of ducks glide across the lake, leaving gentle ripples behind them. Ethan finally turned toward me. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Do you think something that begins as an agreement can become real?" The question was simple, but the answer felt impossibly complicated. I wanted to tell him about Seattle. I wanted to explain that every hour I spent here made leaving harder than I had ever imagined. My phone rested heavily inside my pocket, carrying the confirmation of a future that suddenly felt farther away than 1,200 miles. Before I could gather the courage to speak, Ethan reached out and carefully brushed a loose strand of hair away from my forehead. His hand lingered for only a heartbeat before he leaned closer. The gentle kiss he placed against my lips was brief, hesitant, and filled with quiet sincerity rather than certainty. I did not step away. Instead, I closed my eyes for that single moment and answered the kiss with the same honesty I had been trying so hard to hide. When we finally opened our eyes again, neither of us spoke. We both understood that whatever had just happened was no longer part of any arrangement. Hidden inside my overnight bag back at the lake house was the printed itinerary for my move to Seattle on Monday morning. And for the first time since accepting the job, I found myself wondering whether the future I had planned was already slipping quietly out of my hands. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter, lakeside games, and conversations that felt increasingly difficult to separate from real life. Every time I caught Ethan looking at me, he offered the same quiet smile he had worn on the dock, and every time I returned it, I forgot for another few seconds that this entire weekend had an expiration date. Liam seemed happier than I had ever seen him. He raced between relatives with endless energy, proudly introducing me to anyone who had not arrived the day before. More than once I heard him say, "That is Noah," without adding any explanation at all, as though everyone should already know exactly where I belonged. Near sunset, Ethan's mother asked if someone could help bring extra blankets from the upstairs storage room before the evening bonfire. I volunteered, grateful for a few quiet minutes alone. The hallway was empty as I carried a stack of folded quilts toward the guest room. Just as I pushed open the door with my shoulder, something slipped from beneath the overnight bag resting beside the bed. A large sheet of drawing paper slid across the wooden floor. I bent down and picked it up carefully. Across the top, written in neat block letters, were the words, "My family in 5 years." The picture showed a cozy white house with blue shutters, a tree swing in the front yard, and 3 smiling figures standing together. One was labeled Dad. Another was labeled Liam. The third figure wore glasses and held a sketchbook. Above his head, in careful handwriting, Liam had written my name. Beneath the drawing was a sentence that stole the breath from my lungs. "My dad smiles when Noah is here." I stared at the page for several long moments before quietly setting it back where I had found it. He worked on that for almost a week. Ethan's voice came gently from the doorway behind me. I turned to find him standing there with one hand resting against the doorframe. His expression held no embarrassment now, only quiet honesty. He stepped inside and picked up the drawing himself. His teacher asked everyone to imagine what their family might look like 5 years from now. He smiled sadly at the picture. When I saw this, I realized something that scared me. I waited without interrupting. I realized the person he imagined standing beside us was not imaginary at all. His eyes lifted to meet mine. It was you. Silence settled around us. Outside the window, I could hear distant laughter floating up from the lakeshore. But inside the room, everything felt still. Ethan took a slow breath. No one pressured me to bring someone this weekend. I frowned slightly. Your family never expected you to introduce a partner? He shook his head. Never. The answer landed harder than I expected. Then why? Ethan looked down at the drawing again before answering. Because I wanted to know what it would feel like if, just for 2 days, the life Liam kept drawing actually existed. He swallowed carefully. Not with anyone else. With you. Every memory from the past 2 days rushed through my mind at once. The warm welcome from his mother. The shared bedroom. The family photograph. The kiss on the dock. None of it had happened because circumstances forced us together. Ethan had chosen me from the beginning. You asked me here to test a dream, I said quietly. I asked because I was too afraid to ask for anything permanent. His honesty should have comforted me, but instead something painful tightened inside my chest. Do you realize what you did? I asked. You created a weekend with an ending already built into it. Ethan remained silent. You gave yourself permission to imagine a future while making sure it would disappear before it could become real. He closed his eyes briefly. Maybe. I reached into my overnight bag and slowly removed the folded envelope I had hidden beneath my clothes. Without saying a word, I handed it to him. He unfolded the papers and read the heading. Relocation confirmation. Seattle, Washington. Departure Monday, 8 o'clock in the morning. His face changed almost instantly. You were really leaving. I nodded. I accepted this weekend because I thought it would be easier to say goodbye before anyone knew how much they mattered. Ethan looked from the paperwork back to me, disbelief giving way to quiet hurt. So we both walked into this pretending it could never last. Neither of us had another answer. Outside, someone called our names for the evening celebration, but neither of us moved. For the first time since this impossible weekend had begun, the future waiting beyond Sunday felt heavier than everything we had been pretending to leave behind. Sunday morning arrived beneath a sky so clear that it almost seemed unfair. The storm from the night before had disappeared completely, leaving the lake smooth as polished glass. From the porch, I watched families carrying folding chairs toward the open field where Ethan's parents would renew their wedding vows later that morning. Everywhere I looked, people were preparing for another celebration. Only Ethan and I moved through the house as though we were carrying invisible weight on our shoulders. We exchanged polite words whenever someone spoke to us, but the easy rhythm we had found over the previous 2 days had vanished. Liam noticed the difference before anyone else did. During breakfast, he kept glancing back and forth between us, waiting for one of us to laugh at one of his jokes or finish the other's sentence the way we had the day before. Neither of us did. After breakfast, Ethan quietly asked if we could talk outside. We walked toward the old garden behind the house, where flowering bushes hid us from the growing crowd. Ethan stopped beside a weathered wooden bench and looked down at the ground before speaking. I should never have asked you to come if I knew you were leaving. I folded my arms, trying to steady my voice. And I should have told you the truth before I accepted. He nodded once. Maybe we both wanted something impossible. No, I answered softly. We wanted something real. We just convinced ourselves it had to end before it had the chance to become real. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. I cannot ask you to stay when your future is waiting somewhere else. And I cannot ask you to trust someone who is planning to disappear without saying goodbye. The silence between us said everything neither of us could fix. Finally, Ethan took one slow step backward. Maybe it is better if we stop pretending now. I wanted to tell him that I had stopped pretending the moment he kissed me on the dock. Instead, I simply nodded because I did not trust my voice. We returned to the house, separately. By the time the anniversary ceremony began beside the lake, an empty space seemed to exist between us no matter how close we stood. Liam sat in the front row with his cousins, but he kept looking over his shoulder toward us instead of watching his grandparents exchange smiles and promises. When everyone gathered afterward for one final family photograph, the photographer called for Ethan, Liam, and me to stand together again. Before either of us could move, Liam quietly stepped away from the group. I do not want another picture, he whispered. His grandmother crouched beside him with gentle concern. Why not, sweetheart? Liam lowered his eyes. Because it is not going to stay the same. No one understood what he meant except Ethan and me. A few minutes later, people drifted toward the picnic tables for lunch. Someone asked where Liam had gone. Ethan assumed he was playing with his cousins until one of the children shook his head. He rode his little bike toward the old dock. Ethan's expression changed instantly. We spread out across the property calling Liam's name. I searched the trails leading through the trees while Ethan checked the shoreline. Every passing minute made the quiet feel heavier. Then I noticed something hanging from a split-rail fence near the path to the boathouse. It was Liam's blue baseball cap. I picked it up and immediately called for Ethan. We hurried together toward the dock where a small rowboat rested against the pier. Liam was sitting safely at the end of the dock with his knees pulled against his chest, hugging his stuffed fox, while staring across the water toward the distant road leading out of town. He looked up as we approached, tears filling his eyes before either of us had spoken a single word. I was trying to think of a way to stop Monday, he admitted quietly. Ethan knelt in front of his son and gently placed both hands on the little boy's shoulders. You do not ever have to solve grown-up problems by yourself. Liam looked from his father to me, struggling to hold back another wave of tears. I heard both of you talking yesterday, he whispered. I know Noah is leaving. I know this weekend was supposed to end, but I do not need you to pretend anymore. He wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his sweatshirt and took a deep breath that sounded much older than 8 years. I just need both of you to stop pretending that you do not love each other. His words settled over the quiet lake like the final piece of a truth neither Ethan nor I could hide from any longer. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The only sounds were the gentle waves touching the wooden dock and the distant laughter drifting from the family gathering on the other side of the lake. Liam's words remained suspended between us with a quiet honesty that neither Ethan nor I could escape. Ethan slowly pulled his son into a gentle hug, resting his chin lightly on the top of Liam's head. I am sorry, he whispered. I thought I was protecting you. Liam shook his head. You were protecting yourself. Ethan closed his eyes, and I could see those simple words reaching places that years of polite conversations never had. After a moment, Liam looked at me. Are you still leaving tomorrow? I opened my mouth, but no answer came. For the first time since accepting the job in Seattle, I realized I no longer knew which answer was the honest one. Ethan stood and faced me, his expression calmer than it had been all weekend. There was no panic in his eyes anymore, only quiet certainty. Noah, he said softly, I need to say something without pretending, without rules, and without a deadline. I nodded. When I asked you to come here, I told myself it was only for Liam. That was easier than admitting the truth. He took one slow step closer. The truth is that I chose you long before this weekend. Every time you helped Liam with his homework, every Saturday morning when you came over with fresh pastries, every evening we sat on neighboring porches talking until the porch lights turned on, I kept telling myself it was enough just having you nearby. He smiled sadly. It stopped being enough a long time ago. My chest tightened as every ordinary memory returned with new meaning. Ethan continued. I thought if I gave our time together an ending, I would not have to risk losing something permanent. I believed a temporary happiness would hurt less than a real one. He shook his head gently. I was wrong. I finally found my voice. I was wrong too. Both Ethan and Liam looked at me. I accepted the Seattle job because it felt safer to leave before I built a life I could not bear to lose. Every place I have ever called home eventually disappeared. Every goodbye convinced me it was smarter to leave first. I laughed quietly at myself, though there was no humor in it. Then I met the two of you, and suddenly staying became the frightening choice. Liam reached for my hand without saying a word. His small fingers wrapped around mine with complete trust. Ethan watched us before speaking. Again, I am not asking you to stay until next weekend. He smiled faintly. I am not even asking you to stay until next month. His voice remained steady. I am asking whether you would consider building a future with us because you want one, not because anyone needs you to rescue us. I looked toward the calm water where the sunlight danced across the surface. For 2 days I had believed this lake would become one more beautiful memory I carried somewhere else. Now it felt less like the end of a journey and more like the place where my future had quietly changed direction. I cannot promise that I will never be afraid, I admitted. Ethan nodded immediately. Neither can I. I cannot promise every day will be easy. Neither can I. I smiled through eyes beginning to fill with emotion. but I can promise that I do not want the best weekend of my life to become a story that ends tomorrow morning." Ethan's shoulders relaxed as though he had been carrying an invisible weight for years. He reached for my hand, not carefully this time and not because anyone was watching, but with the simple confidence of someone choosing honesty over fear. I held his hand without hesitation. Liam broke into the brightest smile I had seen all weekend before wrapping both of us in the biggest hug his small arms could manage. "Does that mean nobody has to pretend anymore?" he asked hopefully. Ethan looked down at his son and smiled. "Nobody has to pretend anymore." As we walked back toward the lake house together, the familiar sound of music and conversation grew louder with every step. Ethan's parents spotted us first. His mother noticed our joined hands, paused for only a heartbeat, and then smiled with tears shining in her eyes. She did not ask a single question. She simply opened her arms and welcomed all three of us back into the celebration as though she had been waiting for this moment much longer than any of us realized. For the first time all weekend, there was no performance left to protect, no agreement waiting to expire, and no borrowed future counting down toward Monday. There was only the quiet beginning of something real. 1 year later, the maple tree beside the lake looked exactly the way I remembered it, except this time there were no borrowed smiles, no careful performances, and no invisible countdown waiting to steal the happiness from the people standing beneath its branches. Ethan's parents had invited the entire family back to celebrate another anniversary picnic, and somehow the tradition already felt different. The old wooden house was louder, warmer, and somehow even more welcoming than before. I parked my car beside Ethan's truck and reached into the back seat to grab a flat portfolio case filled with Liam's newest drawings. "Do not bend them," Liam reminded me for what had to be the 10th time that morning. I laughed. "I have been protecting artwork for a living longer than you have been alive." He grinned before running toward his grandparents, who were already waiting on the porch with open arms. Ethan slipped his hand into mine as naturally as breathing. There had been no dramatic overnight transformation after that weekend. We had canceled my relocation together. I accepted a remote illustration contract instead, giving me the chance to stay in Cedar Ridge while continuing my career. Ethan and I had learned that building a family was not one life-changing moment, but hundreds of ordinary choices made every single day. Some mornings we still disagreed about little things, like whether pancakes needed blueberries or chocolate chips. Some evenings Liam insisted that both of us read bedtime stories, because he claimed each of us gave different voices to the characters. There were grocery lists taped to the refrigerator, muddy shoes by the front door, unfinished homework spread across the dining room table, and quiet conversations on the porch after Liam had gone to sleep. None of those moments looked extraordinary from the outside, yet together they became the life I had once been too afraid to imagine. During lunch, Ethan's mother handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was the framed family photograph taken beneath the maple tree the previous year. I stared at the picture for several seconds. I remembered believing that smile belonged to someone who would disappear on Monday morning. Ethan looked over my shoulder and smiled. "I almost threw that picture away after you told me about Seattle," he admitted. "I could not bear looking at something I thought I was going to lose." I turned toward him. "I am glad neither of us was very good at giving up." He laughed quietly. "Neither am I." Later that afternoon, everyone gathered inside the town community center for Liam's annual student art exhibition. Bright paintings covered every wall, celebrating families, neighborhoods, favorite memories, and dreams for the future. Parents wandered from picture to picture, while children eagerly explained every brushstroke. Liam tugged gently on my sleeve until Ethan and I followed him to the largest canvas in the room. Across the top, written in careful blue letters, was the title, "The Weekend We Became a Family." The painting showed the same maple tree, the same lake, and the same three people standing together beneath golden leaves. This time there were more details than before. A sketchbook rested under my arm. Ethan held one of Liam's baseball caps in his free hand. Liam stood proudly between us, smiling toward a bright autumn sky. A local reporter stopped beside the painting and smiled at Liam. "This is beautiful," she said. "Can you tell me who the man standing beside your father is?" Liam looked first at Ethan, then at me, before answering with the same calm confidence that had always amazed me. "He is my dad, too." The reporter smiled warmly. "Has he always been?" Liam shook his head with a little laugh. "Not at first. At first, he only promised us one weekend. Several people around us smiled, assuming it was simply a sweet story invented by a creative child. Ethan quietly wrapped an arm around my shoulders while I rested my hand lightly against his back. Neither of us corrected anyone. We did not need to. The truth had never depended on how many people believed it. As families slowly left the gallery that afternoon, I stood for one last moment in front of Liam's painting. A year earlier, I had believed that love was something temporary, something borrowed, something safer with an ending already planned. I could not have been more wrong. Home was never a place waiting. Somewhere on the other side of 1,200 miles. It had been quietly knocking on my front door all along, asking only for one impossible weekend. We had accepted that invitation together, and somewhere between pretending to become a family and choosing to remain one, we discovered that the happiest endings are not the ones we plan. They are the ones brave enough to begin. 6 months after Liam's art exhibition, life had settled into a rhythm that no longer felt borrowed. Saturday mornings still began with pancakes, although Ethan had finally admitted that blueberries really did belong in the batter. Liam insisted on adding chocolate chips anyway, claiming that every family recipe deserved at least one unnecessary argument. Our neighbors had stopped referring to me as the man next door and simply called me part of the Walker family. I never corrected them because, somewhere along the way, those words had become true. My illustration studio occupied the spare bedroom overlooking the backyard, where I could usually see Ethan sanding pieces of wood in his workshop, while Liam practiced riding his bicycle in careful circles across the driveway. It was an ordinary life, exactly the kind I had once believed was impossible to keep. One quiet afternoon, I found Ethan standing alone on the front porch watching the sunset spread across the neighborhood. He held the old framed photograph from the lake house in one hand. "Do you ever think about that weekend?" he asked. I stepped beside him. "Almost every day." He smiled without taking his eyes off the fading light. "So do I. Sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if you had said no when I knocked on your door." I laughed softly. "I wonder what would have happened if you had never asked." We stood together in comfortable silence until Liam burst through the front door, carrying an envelope from school. "You have to read this," he announced, nearly out of breath. Inside was an assignment for Family Heritage Day. Each student had been asked to interview the people who meant the most to them and create a presentation about what made their family unique. Liam looked from Ethan to me with complete confidence. "I want both of you to help me." We spent the following week sorting through old photographs, ticket stubs, children's drawings, and little memories that had quietly accumulated over the past year and a half. Liam insisted on including the faded sketch he had drawn before the lake trip, the one showing 3 stick figures standing in front of a tiny house. He also wanted to include the newer painting from the art exhibition. Looking at them side by side, I realized they told the entire story without needing many words. One picture showed hope. The other showed that hope fulfilled. On the morning of Family Heritage Day, Ethan and I sat together in the small elementary school auditorium while students proudly introduced parents, grandparents, siblings, and relatives. When it was Liam's turn, he carried both pictures to the front of the room. He held up the first drawing. "I made this before anything happened," he explained. "I drew the family I wished I could have someday." Then he lifted the second painting. "This one came later." His teacher smiled warmly. "What changed?" Liam looked directly toward Ethan and me before answering. "Nothing changed all at once. They just kept choosing each other every day." The room grew very quiet. People think families begin because everyone has the same last name or lives in the same house. Mine began because 2 people stopped being afraid at the same time. I felt Ethan gently squeeze my hand beneath our chairs. There were no dramatic applause breaks or emotional speeches afterward. Parents simply smiled. Children returned to their classrooms, and another ordinary school day continued. Yet as we walked back to the parking lot together, I realized Liam had explained our story better than either Ethan or I ever could. Love had not arrived because of one perfect weekend. It had survived because we continued choosing honesty over fear, conversation over silence, and hope over easy goodbyes. Before climbing into the truck, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a small wooden keychain shaped like a maple leaf. He had carved it himself. On one side were the words, "Home is a choice." On the other side was a single date, the Friday evening when he had first knocked on my apartment door. "I wanted you to have something to remind you," he said quietly. I smiled as I closed my fingers around the smooth wood. I do not need a reminder anymore. I looked at Ethan, then at Liam climbing into the back seat while humming to himself, completely certain that we would all be driving home together. But I will carry it anyway, because every good story deserves something small that reminds us where the happiest chapter truly began. 3 years passed more quietly than either Ethan or I could have imagined. The calendar filled itself with ordinary moments that somehow became the memories we treasured most. Spring meant planting tomatoes behind the workshop. Summer meant fishing from the same old dock where our lives had changed forever. Autumn meant returning to the lake house beneath brilliant maple leaves. Winter meant hot chocolate, old movies, and Liam insisting that every blanket in the house belonged in the living room for what he proudly called family camping night. Somewhere inside those ordinary seasons, I stopped measuring my life by the opportunities one had almost taken and started measuring it by the evenings we all came home to the same front porch. My illustration career continued to grow beyond anything I had expected. Publishers from across the country commissioned children's books, many inspired by quiet moments I had watched Liam experience as he grew older. Ethan's woodworking business flourished as well. His handcrafted furniture became known throughout the state for its simple beauty and careful craftsmanship. Whenever interviews asked either of us where we found inspiration, our answers were almost always the same. We found it at home. One Saturday afternoon, while organizing shelves inside the workshop, Ethan uncovered a dusty cardboard box that had remained sealed since before he and Liam moved into Cedar Ridge. He carried it inside and placed it carefully on the dining room table. "I think I am finally ready," he said softly. I understood immediately what he meant. Inside the box were photographs, handwritten letters, ticket stubs from old vacations, and small keepsakes from the years he had shared with Daniel. Ethan had protected those memories for a long time, afraid that opening them would somehow pull him backward instead of allowing him to move forward. Liam sat quietly beside us while Ethan unfolded each photograph with gentle hands. "Would you like to hear about him?" Ethan asked. Liam nodded without hesitation. I always wanted to. For the next hour, Ethan shared stories that were filled with warmth instead of sadness. He spoke about camping trips, terrible attempts at baking birthday cakes, long drives with the windows down, and the excitement they both felt the day they learned Liam would become part of their family. I listened more than I spoke. Those memories were never something I needed to compete with. They were part of the road that had eventually led Ethan to me. When Ethan finished, Liam carefully placed one photograph back into the box before looking at both of us. "Can I say something?" Ethan smiled. "Always." Liam took a slow breath. "I think people believe loving someone new means forgetting someone else." He looked down at the photographs. But if Dad had forgotten all of this, he would not be the same person. And if Noah had never met the dad who remembered all these things, maybe we would never have become a family either. Ethan quietly wiped at the corner of one eye before pulling Liam into a hug. I wrapped my arms around both of them, and for a long moment the three of us simply stood together in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by memories from different chapters of the same life. That evening, Ethan carried the memory box upstairs instead of returning it to the attic. He placed it on a bookshelf beside our family albums and smiled. "It belongs here now." A few weeks later, the town hosted its annual autumn festival. Booths lined Main Street. Children ran through piles of colorful leaves, and local artists displayed paintings, pottery, and handmade crafts beneath white tents. Liam, now 11 years old, volunteered at the community art booth where younger children could create drawings to take home. I watched from nearby as he patiently encouraged a shy little boy who kept erasing his picture because he thought it was not good enough. Liam smiled and handed him a clean sheet of paper. "You do not have to make it perfect," he said gently. "Sometimes the first picture is only the beginning of the real one." His words made me laugh because they sounded so much like the lesson our own lives had taught us. On our walk home that evening, we passed the little apartment building where I had once packed boxes for Seattle. Someone else lived there now. Fresh flowers decorated the balcony where moving cartons had once been stacked. Ethan noticed me looking toward the building. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. I slipped my hand into his and smiled as Liam skipped several steps ahead, collecting bright red maple leaves. "Only one," I answered. Ethan looked at me with quiet curiosity. I wish I had realized sooner that the life I spent years searching for was already standing on the other side of that front door waiting for me to answer a simple knock. 5 years after that unforgettable weekend, the maple tree beside the lake had grown wider, its branches stretching farther across the shoreline, as if even nature believed families were meant to keep making room for one another. Every October, without fail, Ethan's parents invited everyone back to the lake house. And every October, I found myself standing in almost the exact same place where a photographer had once asked us to smile for a picture that none of us believed would become our future. Only now there was no uncertainty hiding behind our expressions. The smiles came easily because they belonged to real lives instead of borrowed roles. Liam was 13 now, tall enough that he had nearly caught up to my shoulder, although he still claimed he could never outgrow his grandmother's hugs or Ethan's homemade pancakes. He had developed a quiet confidence that reminded me so much of Ethan, paired with a creative imagination that often made me laugh because it mirrored my own. Every sketchbook he filled became another reminder that children do not simply inherit eye color or smiles. They inherit hope from the people who choose to stay. That autumn afternoon, the community center announced a fundraising project to renovate the old public library, including a mural painted by local artists and students together. Liam immediately volunteered before either Ethan or I had the chance to ask whether he was interested. It should tell a story, he insisted during the first planning meeting, not just show pretty pictures. The organizers smiled and asked him what kind of story he imagined. Liam looked toward me for only a second before answering. A story about people finding each other. Over the next several weekends, our garage became a workshop filled with paint, brushes, sketches, and color samples spread across folding tables. Ethan built sturdy wooden frames for the temporary panels, while I helped guide the younger volunteers through the design process. Liam naturally became the unofficial leader of the student group, encouraging every child to contribute one small piece of the final mural. Some painted birds, others added flowers, bicycles, books, or tiny houses with glowing windows. No single section looked complete by itself, but together they created something larger than any one artist could have imagined. Watching those children work side by side reminded me of the lesson that had quietly transformed my own life years earlier. Families are built the same way, not through one grand gesture, but through countless small acts of kindness that eventually become impossible to separate. The mural was unveiled on a crisp Saturday morning beneath bright blue skies. Nearly the entire town gathered outside the library for the ceremony. As the large white cloth was gently pulled away, a wave of quiet admiration spread through the crowd. The finished painting showed a winding path leading toward a welcoming home surrounded by maple trees. Along the path walked people of different ages, carrying books, flowers, musical instruments, pets, and memories. Some held hands. Others simply walked beside one another. Above the doorway of the painted house, written in elegant script chosen by Liam himself, were the words, "Every heart deserves a place to belong." The mayor thanked every volunteer before inviting Liam to explain the inspiration behind the artwork. Standing confidently before the microphone, he smiled in the same calm way he always did whenever he spoke from the heart. "People sometimes think home is the place where your story begins," he said. "I think home is the place where someone chooses to keep reading your story, even after they know every chapter." A gentle silence settled over the audience before warm applause filled the square. I looked at Ethan and saw tears shining in his eyes, though he was smiling too. He leaned close enough for only me to hear. He learned that from watching us. I quietly shook my head. No, we learned it from him first. Ethan laughed softly because he knew I was right. As the crowd slowly dispersed, families stopped to take photographs in front of the mural. Eventually, it was our turn. A volunteer raised the camera while Ethan stood on one side of Liam and I stood on the other. Without anyone asking, Liam reached for both of our hands exactly the way he had years earlier beneath the maple tree by the lake. This time, there was no pretending, no hidden departure waiting on Monday morning, no fear that happiness would disappear if we held it too tightly. The camera clicked once, freezing another ordinary moment that would someday become another treasured memory. Looking at Ethan and Liam beside me, I quietly realized that the greatest gift that one impossible weekend had given us was never the chance to become a family. It was the courage to keep choosing that family every single day that followed. 10 years after Ethan first knocked on my apartment door, the question people asked us most often was not how we met. It was how we had managed to build a family that seemed so peaceful. Every time someone asked, Ethan would smile and look at me, silently offering the answer. I always laughed because we both knew there had never been a secret formula. We had simply chosen each other again and again until those choices became a life. Cedar Ridge had changed over the years, but in many ways it still felt exactly the same. Children still rode bicycles down quiet streets on warm evenings. The old diner still served the best blueberry pie in town. The lake still reflected brilliant autumn colors every October. Our home had grown with us. The spare bedroom that once held my illustration studio had become a larger workspace built beside Ethan's woodshop, where sunlight poured through wide windows every morning. Liam, now preparing for college applications, often worked there after school, sketching ideas for architecture while Ethan offered practical advice, and I quietly added color to his drawings whenever he pretended not to notice. One cool September afternoon, a letter arrived with a university logo printed across the envelope. Liam stood in the kitchen staring at it for nearly a full minute before finally opening it with slightly trembling hands. Ethan and I waited without speaking. Then Liam looked up, his eyes shining with disbelief before a huge smile spread across his face. "I got in," he whispered. "I really got in." Before either of us could react, he laughed and wrapped both Ethan and me into one enormous hug. "I could not have done this without you." Ethan smiled proudly. "You did the hard work." I shook my head. "We only reminded you to believe what was already true." Several weeks later, the town organized a farewell gathering for graduating seniors at the same community center where Liam had once displayed the painting that changed all of our lives. Along one wall, volunteers had created a display celebrating memorable student artwork from previous years. Among dozens of framed pieces hung a familiar painting beneath a simple wooden plaque. The weekend, we became a family. Time had slightly softened the colors, but the three figures beneath the maple tree still smiled exactly as they had all those years ago. Liam stood quietly in front of it for a long time before speaking. "I used to think this painting was about one weekend," he said. "Now I think it was really about every day that came afterward." Ethan rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That is how the best stories work." The evening ended with families taking photographs one final time before students left for new adventures. As everyone gathered outside, the organizer noticed our family standing near the maple trees planted beside the building years earlier. "Would you mind recreating the old picture?" she asked with a smile. We laughed together and stood exactly the way we had beneath the lakeside tree so many years before. Liam naturally stepped into the middle. Ethan reached for my hand without thinking. The camera flashed. This time there were a few new laugh lines around our eyes, a little more gray in Ethan's hair, and a taller young man standing proudly between us, but the feeling inside the picture remained exactly the same. Later that evening, we drove to the lake one last time before Liam left for college. The water was calm, the stars reflected across its surface, and the old dock still stretched quietly into the darkness. We stood there together without rushing to fill the silence. Finally, Ethan smiled and looked at me. "Do you remember the first question I ever asked you?" I laughed softly. "How could I forget?" He squeezed my hand. "If I could go back, I would ask it differently." "What would you say?" He looked toward the lake before meeting my eyes again. "I would not ask whether you could pretend to be my family for one weekend." His smile grew warmer. "I would ask whether you wanted to build a family with me for the rest of our lives." I felt the familiar peace that had replaced fear years ago. "And this time," I answered, "I would not make you wait for my answer." The gentle breeze carried the scent of maple leaves across the water as the three of us stood together on the dock that had once witnessed uncertainty and now quietly reflected gratitude. Looking across the lake, I realized that home had never been a destination waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Home had always been the people willing to stand beside you after the pretending ended, after the fear faded, after every ordinary day proved that love is not measured by how perfectly a story begins, but by the countless quiet mornings, familiar laughter, shared meals, honest conversations, and unwavering choices that continue long after the final page has been turned.